Hello and welcome to World of Warbirds. I'm Brian Pierce. Please sign up at my Patreon to get episodes earlier, bonuses, to have a say on future content, and to interact with me and other Warbirders directly. But mainly you'll have the satisfaction of helping keep this podcast going. You can also toss me a tip via PayPal at WOWB17, or even just drop me a review. Thank you for your support. Now on to the show. Hello Warbirders! Before we get started, thank you to Dale Longmire for his generous PayPal tip. Merry Christmas to you! So if you're listening to this later, I am actually recording it just before the holidays. Okay, so let's dive in. So in this Thunderstorm series, I've been playing with the symbolism of an approaching storm to describe the arrival of the P-47. This is part 3. We've already heard the far-off rumblings of the storm with the P-35, then the buildup of the thunderheads on the horizon, and the clearly defined storm front is approaching with the P-43. But you know how just before a storm sometimes you have this moment of calm when everything is just still and quiet before the gust front hits? Well, ladies and gentlemen, for the purposes of our story, that calm is the last couple of halting efforts before the Thunderbolt itself strikes. The first is the P-44 rocket. So this one doesn't merit an episode all to itself for a bunch of reasons. It was never built, it never flew, and it doesn't even have a storm-based name. So at this point in the story, it is late 1939 into 1940, and the P-43 Lancer is just entering service. On paper, it's a respectable high-altitude interceptor. In the real world, it's a stopgap at best, but over at Republic, they weren't just sitting idle. They were already sketching ways to stretch more performance out of that basic, and maybe getting just a little tired, Savresky P-35 P-43 DNA. Internally, the project was called AP-4J, and which the Army would briefly anoint as the P-44 rocket. If the Lancer was a P-35 with a turbo supercharger, the rocket was basically the same airframe with ambition. Bigger engine, higher ceiling, a bit more speed, more firepower. A logical, incremental evolution. They plan to stuff the new Pratt & Whitney R2180 Twin Hornet under the nose. This was a big 2-row radial promising on the order of 1,400 horsepower, which on paper would push the rocket's performance into the 400 mile per hour class. And in an alternate universe where that engine behaved itself, maybe they would have had something. The USAAC, the U.S. Army Air Corps, thought so and ordered 80 pre-production models. But the big problem was that the world was not standing still or advancing incrementally. Much of the world was already at war, and we Warbirders know what that does to the evolution of aircraft. Every week, fresh combat reports were coming in from Europe. The Battle of France, the early days of the Battle of Britain, the brutal reality check of 1940s aviation. The bomber will always get through? Not necessarily, said the RAF fighter boys. Turret fighters? Well, that was an interesting idea. Suddenly, incremental upgrades weren't good enough anymore. You didn't survive by polishing last year's airframe. You survived by leapfrogging past everybody. And that P-44 rocket, for all its promise, was still tied to that same basic Savresky-derived fuselage shape, the same gear layout, the same internal volume. You could stuff a bigger engine into it, sure, but you'd never get the growth potential that frontline fighters were starting to demand. Then, the killer blow. The bigger engine that they were intending to stuff into it, the R-2180, just wasn't delivering. It simply wasn't enough. It wasn't reliable enough. It wasn't powerful enough, and it was not going to mature quickly enough to matter. It wasn't a single catastrophic failure or anything, more like a slow bleed of promise and priority. On paper, that twin Hornet was supposed to be a powerhouse. 1,400 horsepower, 2 rows of cylinders, way more punch than the P-43's engine, but in practice, it just didn't deliver. The power was lower than advertised, and Republic's engineers began to question whether the trade-off was worth it at all. Meanwhile, over at Pratt & Whitney, they were juggling too many projects. The R-2180 was just one of many babies, and the executives just didn't feel confident enough dedicating the kind of resources that it needed to really mature. Especially when Wright's R-2600 and others were breathing down their neck. In short, the R-2180 wasn't broken in one terrible way, it was just never good enough, fast enough, or timely enough to justify slotting into a frontline fighter. So, Pratt & Whitney quietly shelved it after building only 30 examples. So without that engine, there was no rocket. And without the rocket, there was no reason to keep polishing the old Savresky bones. The P-44 rocket was cancelled before even building a prototype, and the order for 80 units was tossed in the trash. So damn. Now what? Oh, Warbirders, we're getting so close. On August 1st, 1939, Cardvelli proposed what they called internally the AP-10 Lightweight High-Altitude Interceptor. Still searching for an engine, Republic decided that the AP-10 was to be powered by an 1,150 horsepower Allison V17-1039, a 12-cylinder liquid-cooled inline engine. I know. Imagine the jug without the big radial? It just seems wrong. It was to have 2 nose-mounted 50 caliber machine guns. Maximum speed was estimated to be about 415 miles per hour, while gross weight was to be 4,900 pounds. In November 1939, the US AAC asked for a little more firepower, and so 2 30 calibers were added to each wing. The order was given the designation XP-47. Now we're getting somewhere. But early in the new year of 1940, shocking combat reports from the war raging in Europe indicated that, as is, the proposed XP-47 was going to be far inferior to Luftwaffe fighters. The USAAC published new requirements for the fighter, including an airspeed of 400 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, an armament of 6, or actually preferably 8, 50 caliber machine guns, cockpit armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, and a minimum fuel load of 315 gallons. Looking at those sobering requests, Republic scrapped the existing plans for the XP-47, which they now called the XP-47A. Now, here's the funny twist. This cancellation didn't feel like a defeat at the time. It was more like a release or a liberation. Alexander Cardvelli had already started sketching ideas for a much bigger, much wilder machine, something that wasn't shackled to the old P-35 lineage at all. Something that could take a massive turbo system, oceans of fuel, and the largest radial engine Pratt & Whitney could build. So, Republic was suddenly free to take a huge creative leap. The next airplane on the drawing board wouldn't be a better Lancer. The baby got thrown out with the bathwater. Cardvelli began an extensive redesign of the aircraft. It would be something entirely new. Hey, Warbirders, it's time for the Thunderbolt to strike. To start from scratch, Republic made a bold decision. They were going to build the airplane around the engine and the turbo supercharger, not the other way around. So the Allison inline engine was swapped out for the 2,000 horsepower turbo supercharged Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp 18-cylinder radial engine. The very same super engine that would power the Douglas A-26 Invader and Grumman F-6F Hellcat. It was a brute of an engine that looked like someone had hung a giant beer keg behind the propeller. The engine was placed in an oval cowling that opened at the front in what was described as a horse collar shape by folks who would have still been familiar with the shape of actual horse-powered farm implements. This oval cowling admitted cooling air for the engine, the left and right air oil coolers, and the turbo supercharger intercooler system, which was a monster all to itself. The huge engine demanded a huge turbo, and the turbo demanded ducting, big ducting. Hot air flow, cold air flow, intercoolers, wastegates. I will post a photo of the guts of the turbo system on the Patreon page. The whole system looks like the forced air furnace for a building rather than something that belongs on an airplane. Cardvelli realized that it was impossible to cram all of that stuff into a neat little fighter like the P-43. So they didn't cram. They embraced it. You've ever heard that expression, small is beautiful? Well, here, big was going to be beautiful. The XP-47B's fuselage wasn't designed like a traditional fighter. It was designed like a vessel to contain all the stuff within. The belly was essentially a massive tunnel for the turbo system. Air went through the chin scoop, wound its way back through the ductwork, past the turbocharger mounted behind the cockpit, and then came roaring all the way forward again into the engine. At full power, the pipes glowed red, and the turbine spun at 21,300 RPM. There was also a big fuel tank under there in the lower portion of the fuselage. All this gave the XP-47B a very deep fuselage. And so the wings had to be mounted in a relatively high position. This caused trouble because long-legged main landing gear struts were needed to provide ground clearance for the enormous propeller. To reduce the size and weight of the undercarriage struts, and so wing-mounted machine guns also could be fitted, each strut was fitted with a mechanism by which it telescoped out while it extended. Once they had the engines and the fuselage sorted, the wings came next. The Air Corps wanted 8 50 caliber Brownings, guns with massive punch. They would be throwing out 150 caliber bullets per second, and Cardvelli wanted fuel too, lots of it. So the wings became enormous, thick, elliptical, strong all-metal structures with deep internal bays. They could take punishment, they could also store fuel, and they could keep 8 heavy machine guns fed with hundreds of rounds. As I said before, the main landing gear also retracted inward into the wings, telescoping 9 inches to clear the undersides of the fuselage, and the steerable tailwheel was also fully retractable. The cockpit sat high on the fuselage, not for style, but because it had to clear the massive ducting that ran under it. The high spine behind the pilot gave the airframe rigidity and space for the turbo machinery. The result was the familiar razorback silhouette that the first Jugs would carry into combat. Even the air-conditioned cockpit was roomy, and the pilot's seat was comfortable. Some pilots compared it to a lounge chair. Well, visibility wasn't perfect. The razorback prevented that. But as I've said probably too many times, everything in aviation is a compromise. But the pilot sat in what was effectively the command center of an armored ship, and that mattered more to Cardvelli than a few degrees of rearward view. And that brings us to what would become a hallmark of the XP-47B design, which was its survivability. Cardvelli studied what happened to light fighters in Europe. He wasn't building a tiny racehorse. He was building something that could take flak, machine gun hits, cannon shells, and still get home. So he armored the cockpit, protected the fuel tanks, and thickened the skin. It was all metal except for fabric-covered control surfaces. The P-47B's empty weight soared past 9,000 pounds, double that of some earlier fighters. On May 6, 1941, the first P-47B took off on its maiden flight. Some disconcerting smoke in the cockpit, luckily, turned out to be just due to an easily remedied oil drip. Otherwise, the aircraft was impressive in its trials. It achieved a top speed of 412 miles per hour at 25,800 feet and demonstrated a climb from sea level to 15,000 feet in only 5 minutes. The newly renamed United States Army Air Forces placed an order for 171 production aircraft. Republic's Director of Military Contracts, C. Hart Miller, had come up with the name Thunderbolt, and the USAAF was fine with that. So that was the official name, but you know that I always like looking at aircraft nicknames because they usually show what the pilots, the crews, and even the enemy thought of the type. By the time the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was rolling off the assembly lines and into squadron service, it already had a reputation before most pilots had even climbed into the cockpit. And with reputation comes nicknames. The one that stuck, the one that everyone knows today, was the Jug. There's a bit of a debate about where that comes from. Some say it was short for juggernaut. Ever been curious about where that word comes from? Well, I was. And it comes from the Sanskrit Jagannatha, which literally means Lord of the World. Here it works perfectly as a nod to the airplane's massive size, armor, and sheer ability to shrug off punishment. Others joked that it looked like an old-fashioned milk jug flying at 425 miles per hour. I was going to say that younger listeners would have to look up what a classic glass milk bottle looks like. But I'm in my 50s, and I've never obtained milk that way either. But then again, in my part of Canada, much of our milk comes in plastic bags. I know, it's weird, but it works. Anyway, look up an image of a milk bottle on its side and you'll see. Whether jug or juggernaut, either way it was perfect. Big, heavy, strong, and a little ungainly looking in the air. And pilots, of course, love their nicknames. They didn't just call it the Jug. They had affectionate, humorous alternatives too. The aluminum tank, or lead sled, referencing its weight and durability, particularly in dives. Some called it the flying brick, mostly in jest, marveling at how a 10,000-pound fighter could still zoom through the sky with deadly precision. Enemy pilots would notice it too. I've been told that Luftwaffe anecdotes sometimes describe the P-47 as der Aschenbrecher, roughly the ash breaker or anvil breaker. That's a little poetic, but it gets the point across that this was an airplane that was extremely hard to bring down. It could take hits that would destroy lighter fighters, keep flying, and often come home in one piece. Although Republic finally had a hit, they never stopped tinkering to make it better. After the first 171B orders were delivered in September 1942, they introduced the P-47C. This variant had a redesigned metal rudder, as the original fabric-covered unit was prone to tail flutter, which had unfortunately led to crashes. A new oxygen system was fitted, as well as new radios. You could spot the P-47C as it had the upright antenna mast, which replaced the B's forward swept mast, which did look a little goofy to my eyes anyway. They built 602 P-47Cs until February 1943, and this was the Thunderbolt that went to war. Jugs began arriving in England in January 1943 and were introduced to two fighter groups that were already there. I wonder what the pilots of the 4th Fighter Group thought when they first saw the Thunderbolt. They were former RAF Eagle Squadron members, U.S. citizens who had signed up with the RAF before the entry of the U.S. into the conflict. And they were used to flying nimble Spitfires. At first, they viewed their new fighter with misgivings. It was huge. The British pilots joked that a Thunderbolt pilot could defend himself from a Luftwaffe fighter by running around and hiding in the fuselage. The 78th Fighter Group got Jugs too. I wonder what they thought also, as they were trading 2 engines for 1. Albeit pretty big engine. They were used to flying P-38 Lightnings. When the Jug first arrived in England in early 1943, it didn't exactly roll onto the stage as the superstar it would later become. In fact, the early days were a little rough. The 8th Air Force had been begging for a high-altitude, high-performance escort fighter to protect the daylight bomber offensive. And when they finally got the P-47C models, the reaction was somewhat mixed. Yes, it had excellent dive performance and a powerful punch with its 850s, but it had a poor rate of climb, very slow rate of acceleration, radio problems, and probably the worst thing was that the early P-47s had very short legs. Like Dachshund short. What I mean is that the range was short, very short. Early training flights showed that Jug pilots could barely escort the big B-17s and B-24s beyond the coast of France, let alone deep into Fortress Europe. Bomber crews took one look at their new escort fighter and gave them the side eye. What good is an escort that can't come with you all the way? But what the Thunderbolt lacked in range, at least initially, it made up with in raw power, and the Luftwaffe was about to get a taste. It was the 10th of March, 1943, before the 4th Fighter Group took their aircraft on a fighter sweep over France, looking for a fight. The mission didn't go so well due to radio trouble. It took until the 8th of April to sort that out. Dividends began to be paid on the 15th of April when Major Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group knocked down a Focke-Wulf FW-190, scoring the Thunderbolt's first air victory. Thinking about the mix of attributes that was the early P-47 brings me back to an extremely deep and astute piece of advice that I learned from a certain gray-haired and bearded philosopher known as Kenny Rogers, written in one of his most important works, The Gambler. Open quotes. Every gambler knows that the secret to surviving is knowing what to throw away and knowing what to keep. 'Cause every hand's a winner and every hand's a loser, and the best that you can hope for is to die in your sleep. Close quotes. One man that was able to figure out what to do with this imperfect hand of cards was Hubert Zemke. He had been born to German immigrant parents on March 14, 1914. Initially, he wanted to be a forester, but in 1936 tried out for pilot training in the United States Army Air Corps, and in 1937 became a Curtiss P-40 pilot with the 36th Pursuit Squadron at Langley Field, Virginia. In 1940, he basically earned a master's degree in air combat tactics when he was sent to England as a combat observer with the Royal Air Force, making observations of the workings of both the RAF and the Luftwaffe. In 1941, he was sent to the Soviet Union to check out Russian pilots in flying their Lend-Lease P-40 Tomahawks. Following the U.S. entry into the war, Zemke made his way back to the USA, where one of his assignments was to test fly the new P-47. He was actually not very impressed with the maneuverability or the performance of the fighter, but his previous experiences and studies had made him perhaps the perfect guy to turn this hand into a winner. On September 16, 1942, Major Zemke was made group commander of the 56th Fighter Group, which was the first fighter group to fly the P-47, and told to prepare it to deploy to England. In January 1943, the 56th moved to England in order to act as the bomber escorts in the offensive against Germany with the 8th Air Force. Zemke honed the 56th proficiency with the P-47 and stressed dive, fire, and recover tactics. His philosophy was simple: do not dogfight with the Bf-109 or FW-190. Use altitude, use speed, use weight, and when it comes time to attack, dive like the hand of God. Everything began to pay off. By October of 1943, the 56th, which now called themselves Zemke's Wolfpack, had claimed 39 German aircraft shot down for the loss of only one of their own, including 34 in an intense 10-day period of bomber escort operations between October 4 and October 14th. During that crazy time, Zemke scored his 5th kill, making him an ace. We'll get back to Zemke later, but first, to truly appreciate what he and his Wolfpack had done, we have to look at some of the teething problems that the big fighter had to iron out. Initially, radio interference from the R-2800's ignition system made it almost impossible to communicate. P-47 pilots joked that during their missions, they could talk to God through prayer, but not to their wingmen. Turbo supercharger complexity meant that rookies who didn't understand their ducts, doors, and wastegates sometimes overboosted themselves into cooked engines. Remember, the turbo supercharger on the P-47 was located way back in the tail, so there were the long exhaust pipes to the turbine in the rear, then the long compressed air ducts back up to the engine, mixed in with intercoolers in between, and automatic wastegate controls trying to keep all this balanced. This all caused a lag between throttle movement and power output. And if the pilot wasn't patient and mindful of manifold pressures, he could overboost the 2,000 horsepower radial at altitude and destroy it. The automatic wastegate was supposed to save the day by dumping overboost pressure out, but especially in the early days, oil or carbon contamination or extreme cold at altitude could affect the mechanism and interfere with the controller. Maintenance crews eventually figured it out, but early on, it caused trouble. Also, the Razorback's rearward cockpit visibility wasn't ideal when dogfighting. And of course, the big problem was severely limited range. But fixes were in the mix. New electronic shielding cleared up the radios. Better training helped pilots master the engine. But the Jug certainly had advantages. By the summer of 1943, the Thunderbolt had shaken off its teething pains, and its strengths were becoming impossible to ignore. It had outstanding high-altitude performance, and nearly unbreakable structural strength. The 850 caliber machine guns were a ridiculous amount of firepower for a fighter. The turbo supercharger gave it excellent high-altitude performance once mechanics learned its quirks, and it had a dive capability no German fighter could match. The P-47 could dive faster than any fighter in Europe. Some pilots thought that they had actually achieved Mach 1 in a diving jug. They hadn't. It was due to an error in their pitot tubes. Have I told you about pitot tubes before? No, I don't think I have. To measure the airspeed of an aircraft, designers place a forward-facing tube in the slipstream. The faster the plane goes, the more air is pushed in there, and this pressure turns a needle on the airspeed indicator dial on the flight instruments. Now, there is a bit more complication to it. As you climb, there is less air pressure in the atmosphere. So if designers didn't do anything about it, it would actually show airspeed bleeding off when it just isn't. So they added another port to the side of the fuselage called the static port, which just measures atmospheric pressure. The airspeed indicator actually compares these two pressures to get a reading on speed. Well, another error comes into play when you're going really fast. Pressure builds up and shows an unpredictably exaggerated airspeed. So the jug pilots weren't breaking the sound barrier, but they were able to dive mighty fast. American pilots soon learned that they could choose when to engage and when to escape. You could hit a formation of 190s, blow through them, and be halfway back to the channel before Jerry would even try to follow. Supposedly, German pilots soon developed their own other nickname for the jug. Der Rasenmäher, the lawnmower, for what those 850s could do to anything unlucky to get beneath them. Beneath them is an important term, because that was one way to get away from the lawnmower. Kurt Bühlingen, a German fighter ace, stated, open quotes, "The P-47 was very heavy, too heavy for some maneuvers. We would see it coming from behind and pull up fast, and the P-47 couldn't follow, and we could come around and get on its tail in this way." Close quotes. Before we move on, let's be careful about accepting alleged Luftwaffe nicknames for the P-47, such as der Rasenmäher. As we've seen with other types like the P-38 Lightning, sometimes there's not much evidence that they actually use the particular moniker. So the jug could dive, but it had trouble in a climb. Now, normally in our Warbird series, we'd say that more engine power was needed. Well, not in this case. The poorish climb rate was not due to a lack of power. That R2800 in the nose made all the right noises and pumped out enough horsepower, but with those early narrow-bladed Curtiss props, the big jug just couldn't grab enough air to turn engine power into thrust. So something needed to be done. But the P-47 did not need a new engine or even an upgraded engine. It needed a good it needed a good paddle-bladed propeller. By mid-1943, Republic and the propeller manufacturers rolled out a new generation of paddle blade propellers, first from Curtiss and then from Hamilton Standard. These new props were unmistakable, broad, muscular blades with far more surface area and a more efficient airfoil shape. We have to remember that propellers are airfoils, or essentially spinning wings. If the original props were just trying to row a canoe with a salad fork, the paddle blades were the full-size oar that the jug had been waiting for. And the difference was like night and day. Almost immediately, climb rate jumped by several hundred feet per minute. Not through some obscure tweak, but simply because the prop could finally use the power the engine already had. Takeoff runs were shorter, acceleration felt sharper, zoom climbs had some real authority to them. Pilots said it was like flying a different airplane, one that finally lived up to the size of the engine and the promise of its design. Group commanders who'd been grumbling about the Jug's sluggishness stopped grumbling. Don Blakeslee, who was never shy about voicing his opinions, reportedly told his maintainers, "Now this is the prop the airplane should have had all along." And he wasn't wrong. With the paddle blades, the Jug transformed from a fast but stubborn climber into the high-performance bruiser it was meant to be. A machine that could form up quickly, dive like a missile, and still claw for altitude when the mission called for it. In short, the paddle blade propellers didn't just improve the Thunderbolt, they unlocked the Thunderbolt. So now that the Jug could climb like it meant it, the US AAF put it straight to work on the job that mattered most in 1943. Keeping the bombers alive. The daylight bombing offensive over Europe was in a dangerous place. B-17s and B-24s were flying deeper and deeper into German airspace. And the old idea that the bomber will always get through seemed like a quaint and naive saying from another age. Actually, it was. The Luftwaffe was meeting the American bomber formations with just about everything they had. Bf-109s, FW-190s, twin-engine destroyers, even rocket-firing heavy fighters. This was their Battle of Britain, and they would spare no effort. At first, the Jagdwaffe, or the fighter force, didn't think much of the new American fighter with the chubby fuselage and the unexciting climb rate. And early on, the criticism wasn't entirely unfair. Thunderbolts simply couldn't escort the bombers very far over the continent. Their combat radius was limited, and missions into central Germany were still beyond reach, and the P-47s were practically chained to the bomber formation in a stifling close escort role. But give the US AAF time and they will fix things. What was that alleged Churchill quote? "You can always count on Americans to do the right thing, after they have tried everything else." Sorry about that. The paddle blades were one fix. The next problem was range. That mighty R-2800, the big fuselage, the turbo ducting, the thick wings. Everything that made the Jug fast, tough, and high-flying also made it a very thirsty bird indeed. And in early 1943, thirst was the one thing the US AAF could not afford. The daylight bombing campaign was pushing deeper into occupied Europe, and the Luftwaffe was responding with brutal efficiency. The bombers desperately needed escorts that could go the full distance. The P-47 could not. Well, at least not yet. Before the war, the U.S. Army Air Corps had always been a little squeamish about drop tanks. Partly due to the whole "the bomber will always get through" thing. If the bomber will get through, then you don't need escort fighters, and so you don't need anything to extend the range of the fighters you do have. There were other disparaging attitudes too, such as, if a fighter can't go the distance on internal fuel, it needs a better design, not a strap-on solution. External tanks could be seen as tactically risky. Extra drag, extra weight, and a nightmare scenario if the pilot was unable to release a stuck tank in a dogfight. So, the US AAF was not keen on external drop tanks. But by the time that the US AAF was still fretting about the early P-47's limited 175 to 230 mile ranges, the RAF, the Japanese, and the Luftwaffe were all using drop tanks. And by 1943, the US AAF needed them desperately. The British were already producing 108-gallon paper tanks. Yes, they were made from laminated craft paper sealed with glue and lacquer. They were cheap, fast to manufacture, and crucially, they did not use strategic metals. Initially, when the US AAF first saw them, reactions ranged from skepticism to amusement. Pilots said, "Y'all want me to fly into Germany with a gas tank made of cardboard?" But they worked. The first batches of Thunderbolts in England began using them in 1943. These tanks gave the Jug the extra range to reach the Dutch coast, or later penetrate into Belgium and Western Germany. Not full deep escort, but enough to start pushing the fight towards the enemy instead of waiting for the enemy to come to the bombers. The next step was the 150-gallon belly tank, a welded metal design that fit cleanly under the fuselage. And with this tank, completely changed the Jug's combat radius. It could now escort bombers deeper into occupied Europe, loiter longer around the bomber stream, perform fighter sweeps ahead of the heavies, and still have fuel to dogfight. Where earlier Thunderbolt groups had to turn back mid-channel, now they were catching Luftwaffe fighters as they took off. By late 1943, Republic began modifying Thunderbolt to carry 2 wing-mounted drop tanks in addition to the belly tank. This not only extended range, but also shifted weight distribution to improve handling during long cruise segments. Now the P-47 could carry 108 paper tanks on the wings, a 150-gallon tank under the belly, plus improved internal fuel, and still climb to escort altitude with the new paddle-bladed props. The last bit to really unleash the Jug was to, unleash the Jug. In early 1944, General Jimmy Doolittle changed the doctrine. He gave his famous order, gain air superiority, destroy the German Air Force, and freed up the American fighters from tight bomber escort. The P-47's drop tanks became even more critical. They allowed Thunderbolts to race ahead, hit airfields, smash fighters forming up, and strafe anything that moved. The 850 cal Brownings were bad enough in level flight, but when a P-47 peeled over and went downhill, those guns had almost laser-like accuracy thanks to the airplane's great stability. German pilots learned quickly, never let a Thunderbolt get above you. In fact, some Luftwaffe pilots refused to follow a Jug into a dive because they knew they could not keep up. Thunderbolts were routinely hitting speeds that would rip the wings off a 109 or 190. The Germans could either break away or watch the American fighter grow larger in their canopy until it filled everything. By late 1943, the doctrine change meant that escort didn't just mean flying next to the bombers. Jug groups began pushing ahead, conducting fighter sweeps to clear the airspace before the heavies arrived. They hit airfields, bounced climbing interceptors, and mauled staging areas. It was aggressive, offensive flying, the kind the P-47 excelled at. Every Luftwaffe pilot shot down on the way to an interception was one less gun firing at the bomber stream. By the time the 8th Air Force hit its stride in early 1944, the Thunderbolt had become a central tool in the systematic destruction of German fighter strength. That meant fighters, P-47s, P-51s, and the last of the P-38s, were free to roam, hunt, ambush, and attack wherever the Jagdwaffe gathered. The P-47, with its ruggedness and firepower, was perfect for this mission. It could bounce enemy fighters at altitude and then roar down to strafe airfields, trains, and aircraft on the ground, shrugging off flak that would seriously trouble other Allied fighters. The Luftwaffe was now fighting a war on 2 fronts. P-47 smashing everything around the frontiers, airfields, and defensive belts, and the Jugs had a new friend to help. If the P-47s were a great little friend to help clear out the Luftwaffe, the new P-51 Mustangs were even better, at cutting even deeper into Germany, and the Jugs were to get a new role: ground attack. But that part of the Jugs' operational life is going to have to wait until next time. We'll take it from high-altitude bomber escort down to the dirt of ground pounding, to the Mediterranean, the Pacific, Alaska, Russia, China, Burma, India, and beyond. We'll even try to turn the Jug into a jet. Until next time.